Hello everyone, nice to be here today at SREdays for presenting our research. So this is exclusive research that we conducted in our company Escape. I'm Tristan, I'm the CEO of the company, but I was an engineer before, and I'm today with Antoine, our CTO, who is the lead on this research. So we are speaking about security. This is a bit different than the previous talk, and more specifically about the security of GraphQL APIs. Who has heard about GraphQL already? Yeah, of course. More than half of the people did. So GraphQL are very cool new kind of APIs that have been around for a little bit of time. So first, a little bit about Escape. So we are the first automated API inventory and security testing platform, which has the ability to do proactive monitoring on microservices at scale very easily. So during this research, we scanned about 1,600 GraphQL APIs. It took us more than 416 hours of computation time to get those results. And we found about 50,000 security alerts on those production GraphQL APIs. So this is quite a big study. So it means about 30 security alerts per production API, which is quite a lot. We'll detail the result of this study in a public report, which is called the State of GraphQL Security 2023. You can download it for free. I really encourage you to do it. It has some nice data and charts inside of it. So first, I will let my co-founder Antoine present to you why is GraphQL specifically vulnerable. What is GraphQL and why is it vulnerable?
So thank you very much, Tristan. So yes, indeed, I think since only half of you have heard about GraphQL so far, it could be great to start with a really simple overview of GraphQL. So GraphQL is not a simple query language, another query language for database. It's more than that. It's actually a federation layer that allows to combine multiple data sources together in one single endpoint that is actually available for not only for front-end developers, but for the entire company and all the teams in the company. And thanks to its amazing federation capabilities, GraphQL actually is now gaining ground in all Fortune 500 verticals, especially in retail and finance and in communications. But the thing is that actually, GraphQL has amazing features, but with great features also comes great responsibilities. And in particular, we can see for all of the features here, they also come with their sets of potential vulnerabilities that we are going to go through afterwards. The second thing that is really important to understand is that GraphQL is a graph. And all data are actually connected together in this graph through different paths, of course, and the data are accessible through different paths, which makes access control a real nightmare and really difficult to maintain in GraphQL. And this is also something we are going to extend a little bit after. So the second part here consists in understanding the methodology, how we manage to actually collect this data and to test those GraphQL endpoints in production. So the first problem we face actually in testing automatically GraphQL APIs, but actually any other kind of APIs, is that we cannot simply send random payloads onto the APIs, as they will be actually stuck at the data validation layer. That's why we developed an in-house technology here that is called feedback-driven API exploration, and that is actually able to generate legitimate sequences of requests on any GraphQL APIs by reusing the data it encounters and reinjecting it before attempting some complex attack chain scenarios, which make that with this algorithm, the requests, they actually pass the data validation layer, and they are really able to test the security in depth of the GraphQL API. This technology does not require any production traffic, so it does not endanger the data of customers. here is an example between what was done before with tools such as OWASP, for example, that you might know. OWASP only considers the typing of the variables, which makes often incoherent data according to the business logic, but only through the typing. As with our technology, we managed to, for example, re-inject real user IDs of users that actually exist in the database. We inject emails at the right place, and we know where to put injections in relevant fields and attempt vulnerabilities injections in that case. So again, the other complex things in testing automatically GraphQL APIs is that GraphQL is a graph, so we already saw that. So we must ensure that we test every single path leading to the resource to make sure that the application is properly covered and the test has a high coverage. So now let's move to the findings. So actually, during these studies, as Tristan mentioned, we found almost 50,000 security alerts. What is interesting to begin with is that classic vulnerabilities of web applications are still there. So very briefly, without entering into details, because the goal here is to extend on GraphQL specific vulnerabilities, we can see information disclosure, excessive error disclosure in error messages, which is really classic. For example, if you keep debug mode enabled in production. We can see a lot of access control issue. 9% of endpoints are misconfigured, of GraphQL endpoints are misconfigured in terms of access control, which is actually huge. For example, here we can see that we have write routes that are publicly accessible, which is in most cases a problem. And of course, injections are still there, and all legends in web applications, even in GraphQL. So now I will let Tristan go through the GraphQL specific vulnerabilities that are really relevant to present you today.
Thank you, Antoine. So, as Antoine explained, we have some classic vulnerabilities that were found during this study on GraphQL. But GraphQL is a graph, and it's also a programming language for aggregating microservices. So it comes with its own security flaws, which are overrepresented in our studies. So the common security flaws that comes with GraphQL are related to API brute forcing, denial of service, internal schema leak, and unsafe public operations. And I will cover like the most common ones and the most critical ones. So the first thing is that GraphQL comes with a nice feature which is called aliasing or batching, and it allows to stick several different API calls together in one single HTTP request. But if you do that, you can bypass the rate limitation if the rate limitation has been done at the HTTP level and not at the GraphQL level, at the application level, which is in the cases with most ingress controllers, as you might know. So if you exploit this, you might be actually able to send, for instance, in a single HTTP request, a lot of combination of login passwords and usernames, and thus gain the control of user accounts. So it can the consequences of this problem can lead to stolen user accounts and data exfiltration due to the rate limiting abuse. The second problem that we have is that just like programming languages, GraphQL has a feature called fragments. So fragments are kind of an equivalent of a function. It's like a piece of logic that you can reuse across GraphQL queries. But what happens if you create a fragment that calls itself? Well, you can create actually an infinite recursion loop inside of the GraphQL engine, which might just cause a big denial of service and crash the full microservice. And that's even worse. If you're using GraphQL as an aggregation layer for all your services, you might have all your services causing a denial of service and not be available. So this can cause denial of service and API unavailability. And the last vulnerability that we found very commonly in GraphQL, it's called the internal schema leak through field suggestion. So basically, GraphQL has a nice feature that allows anyone who makes a query with a typo to get information about what he could have written instead. So for instance, in this case, the person wrote create session with one S, and the GraphQL API is gentle and tell, hey, did you mean this or that? The problem is this can be used and abused by hackers to build back the full schema. So this is a full GraphQL schema that we built back that was supposed to be hidden, and we were able to build it back using the open source tool Clairvoyance with a single command line in Bash. And even worse, in this case, the developers thought they were secure because they didn't display the schema publicly. So they created an update admin root inside of their API, which was not supposed to be public, and they did not add any form of access control on it. So we were actually able to update the password of the admin user on this platform just because they tried to do security by obscurity. So the consequences of this can be access to unauthorized functions, and also it is a start for easy compromission of the API further because the external malicious actors have access to a lot of internal information about the structure of the API and the architecture. Okay, after the technical vulnerabilities, there is also another thing that was striking in this study. It's the amount of sensitive data that was made public by GraphQL APIs. So we found about 5,000 potential PII and secrets in public GraphQL APIs on the internet. We found emails, we found phone numbers, passport numbers, bank account numbers, so a lot of personal and financial information that was disclosed publicly in those GraphQL endpoints. But even worse, we found also API keys like AWS tokens, GCP tokens, sometimes with elevated privileges that would allow to connect to the Google API or to the Amazon Web Console, private RSA keys, SSH keys, auth tokens for various services like Asana, GitHub, or Adobe. So this is a very big problem among the GraphQL APIs that we scan. So if I do a quick recap of what we found, and especially for an SRE point of view and for site reliability, GraphQL is very, very vulnerable to denial of service. It's very easy for anyone to exploit a misconfigured GraphQL API and just cause the microservice to crash or to consume a lot of resources. Mostly because there are GraphQL specific features that make it hard to limit the amount of the resources that are consumed by the GraphQL server. Also, GraphQL is very prone to access control problems, which can lead to a lot of sensitive data that is stolen. And finally, it also have a lot of misconfigurations and information disclosure that gives information about your internal architecture or your internal microservices or your API schemas, which can be further exploited by hackers to enter your architecture and your services. So as a conclusion, for this study, we found about 130,000 public GraphQL APIs, and we scanned 1,600 of them, which were fully public. We highlighted numerous vulnerabilities. Most frequently, they were GraphQL specific, but not only. There were also classic API vulnerabilities. And we found that denial of service are very frequent in GraphQL, and it can be a single point of failure if the GraphQL is using as a federated way of aggregating APIs together and as a gateway for the external usage. So again, all the results of this study is present in the State of GraphQL Security 2023. So feel free to download the reports. It's completely free, and we are happy to hear feedback about it. Before we jump to the questions, we have two more nice things to show. They are both open source. So first, we released the API Security Academy, which is a free academy and open source, so you can create your own courses on GitHub for developers. It's very nice because it uses web containers to actually spawn a server, a full-featured server, and an IDE inside of your browser, and let the developers practice the security inside of their browser. And the second thing is GraphQL Armor. So GraphQL Armor is a free and open source security middleware that you can easily integrate in your production GraphQL server, and it will make them resistant to denial of service and to the abuse of resources. So you just have to integrate this middleware in one line of code, and it will block the request that will consume too much resources and could create denial of service. So this is the end of this presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I would love to answer your questions.